What makes a democracy? I was raised in the US during the Cold War, and in this existential struggle between democracy or capitalism and communism, we were imbued with the sense that there were characteristics in our country, in the US and our society, that really differentiated itself from other countries. The U.S. kind of put forward itself as a beacon on the hill because of the democratic history and ideology and mythology that the country had about itself, and what went into making the country special. Democracy was at the heart of it. And in this class, I think there's several characteristics of what makes a democratic system, and the lack of can make a better understanding of an autocratic system. But in the last video, I asked you what you thought went into making a democracy, and I look forward to seeing whether you conceptualize democracy as kind of a minimalist definition, one that just means regularly held elections, or one that's more comprehensive, a liberal democratic view of democracy, one that's defined by a constitutional government, whether there's a formal or informal constitution that regulates how different branches of the government can relate to each other, as well as the rights that are given to individuals within that state. Representative democracy is another characteristic of a democratic system, in which you have, in states that are too large compared to Athens 2,000, 3,000 years ago, 2,500 years ago, in which everyone wasn't able to participate in democracy, but those that were considered citizens, men that were landholders, were able to directly govern the state in which they lived. Now we have representatives that go to capital cities like Canberra, where I am now, to represent the interests of their selectorate, the people who chose them to come to office. But the idea that you have representatives, this principal agent framework in which you have people working in the interests of the broader population through representative Republican government. Separation of powers would be another important characteristic of a democratic system that researchers have focused on, in which you have legislative and executive functions, sometimes like in parliamentary systems, imbued in the same political leadership, prime ministers and their cabinet. Or in presidential systems, you have the legislative and executive functions separate, and you have constraints of who can bring up legislation, what powers the legislature has to constrain the executive, and the executive to be able to veto legislation that comes from legislatures, as well as the judiciary. Often, the judiciary doesn't get mentioned enough in the study of international relations or domestic politics, but for those of my students at the ANU that often have dual majors with law degrees, I think there's a lot of overlap, and you see the importance of the judicial functions both in elections, like in Uttar Pradesh this week, or in the United States after the 2000 election between Al Gore and George W. Bush. But then also just in protecting individual rights when they are potentially violated by the government or by other actors. Judicial, that kind of bleeds into the judicial and legal rights. Separation of powers with the judiciary is more about how the judiciary can constrain the legislature or the executive, but then also how they're one of the main firewalls against governments unduly repressing their citizens. And then lastly is individual participation. Living in Australia, it is amazing the compulsory vote for national elections, which we're due to have one in May this year. I was able as a citizen now to vote in the ACT election a couple of years ago. The difference is that having a nominal fee or nominal cost to not voting does get the vast majority of people out to vote. And There's been research that suggests compulsory voting as well as other means of encouraging individual participation in civic life can have a crucial effect on the perception of legitimacy of the government in the citizens' eyes, as well as allowing citizens to potentially become more engaged in the policymaking within a particular country. So a lot of different definitions and characteristics of a democratic system, from a written constitution to our elected representatives to the separation of the powers in the legislature and other executive and judicial branches, the role that those laws, some of which are outlined in the Constitution, others in the legal system, can constrain government's powers as well as our individual actors in the interests of domestic security. And then our individual participation in civic life has been found to be a significant predictor in the perceived legitimacy of a government, which would in turn decrease the chance in the likelihood of conflict, which we're going to be talking about in a second. So that is the theoretical background for how a whole subfield talks about the nature of political institutions. I, of course, didn't do it justice, but for the purposes of this class, for those students who aren't political science majors, who come from other fields, this is the Cliff Notes, the brief outline of the theoretical elements that go into our conceptions of democracy. The challenge, of course, as with a lot of things in this class, is linking these general theories of conflict, why people would go to conflict, how important are elites or the masses in shaping those decisions, democratic institutions, as well as economic security, which we talked about last week, are crucial in our general understanding of what the drivers of conflict are. So economics and political institutions, those are the two legs of the stool of theoretical approaches to conflict. However, in the next week and subsequent weeks, we're going to be adding on to those fundamental approaches, environmental concerns, human security concerns, and other elements that interact with both economics and political participation, and that could be increasingly relevant in explaining the kind of conflicts that we see today. Which is a long-winded way of kind of saying there's the theory and then there's the evidence. And in the evidence, there's different ways of defining what a democracy is. This table is summarizing the way in which the Polity score, which is arguably the most common measure of democracy around the world today. There's a bunch of others. I mentioned Freedom House, The Economist. The Varieties of Democracy is a new project to codify those theoretical conceptualizations of democracy and link it to countries that we can see over time, to compare countries against each other, but then also to compare how countries have evolved over time to be more or less democratic. So there's two ways of kind of conceptualizing this institutionalized democracy. In the Polity score, you see the importance of how competitive executive recruitment is. Is it through an election or some other means? How open it is, what constraints there exist are on the chief executive, as well as how competitive political participation is. So with the constraints and the competitiveness, keep this in the back of your mind when we start talking about Turkmenistan in the end of lecture today. And there are differences in people's preferences for democracy. There's a lot of survey research out that have shown democracy's popularity soaring in the 1990s, and in the last decade, there's been increasing skepticism of democratic institutions. And for a recent article that I published, I looked at the difference between the genders for democratic preferences in Guatemala during a civil war and then afterwards, and then in all Latin American countries. And what you do see is the preferences by and large are stronger for men for democratic institutions than women. And there's been a whole host of research trying to explain the differences in gender preferences, ethnic preferences, different societies' preferences and support for democracy. The World Values Survey has done these questions over time, but this is basically just to highlight the differences between different groups within countries in their preferences for democracy to kind of help us understand the variation within countries. You have one overall measure of democracy, but the amount of support that it has can be quite different depending on who you are within that country. This is also showing from that same article in International Studies Review on the growth in research on democratization, democracy protests, election violence, not as much as protests, contentious politics definitely in recent years, and contentious elections have become increasingly important over time, because I think as those international conflicts like the Russian invasion in Ukraine, people thought were less likely to happen in the 21st century. There's been a lot of academic research on how elections can lead to instability at a lower level and how that connects to democratic institutions. It'd be interesting to see how the events of the last 4 or 5 years, the research is starting to come out on how how well these democratic institutions have behaved over the last 20 or 30 years in providing for their citizens' needs has shaped the willingness to use protest, violence, or leading up to conflict in order to try to change those political institutions that we're going to look at, and potentially a backslide, right? Because democratic institutions, as we've learned in the last 15 or 20 years in a way that in the aftermath of the Cold War, everyone thought there was a ratchet effect, that once you become democratic, you weren't likely to backslide, especially if you're an economically developed country. However, there's also been a lot of research in recent years on autocratic and anocratic regimes. Autocratic regime, I mentioned the characteristics of democratic regimes. Here are a couple of characteristics of autocratic regimes that Barbara Geddes and other co-authors have come up with, whether the regime is ruled by the military, by a specific political party. Like the military, an example would be Myanmar after the coup in the last couple of years. Political party, that would be like the Chinese Communist Party ruling China. A personalist regime, Turkmenistan would be an example of that, in which the autocracy centers on the interests and behavior of one particular leader. And that, of course, ties into a monarchical system in which you have, like with Saudi Arabia or Brunei, traditional monarchies in which you have both the head of state and the head of government as one particular person. So similarly to how Polity defines an institutionalized democracy, they also have another scale of institutionalized autocracy, which focuses on similar characteristics of how the leader is selected and what constraints there are upon that leader, except basically the scores are reversed. That instead of being open through election, the executive recruitment is closed or chosen by particular leaders, and there's unlimited authority or some kind of limitations on it. So these are the kind of two polar opposites of political institutions. And what Polity does is they subtract one from one score from the other, the democratic characteristics minus the autocratic characteristics, and they come up with one score that goes from -20, -10 to +10. So it's a 21-point scale. You've probably seen, if you are a political science student, this in other classes, but I thought it was worth mentioning here how the sausage is made, that it's an overall score in which if you score a 6 or above, you're considered a consolidated democracy. If you're a -6 or below, you're a consolidated autocracy. And if you're somewhere in between, you're that kind of mixed anocratic system. And there was a lot of pushback against the Polity program when they came out and reduce the United States score, in which the U.S. was no longer considered a consolidated democracy. So these kind of scores and the trends over time can be important for political leaders, for their citizens' legitimacy, for foreign aid coming into these countries, as well as how we understand the evolution of political institutions within particular countries. And this is just a graphic of this showing, this is the latest graph that they have on their website, in which you see the autocracies in red peaking in the 60s and 70s and declining after the Cold War, and the democracies increasing dramatically in the aftermath of the Cold War. But those anocratic systems that have some autocratic and some democratic systems have stayed relatively constant. And what we're going to look at in this class is to try to understand what effect that's having on domestic political instability within particular countries. Another way of looking at this, and with different measures, because in this class I try to stress the desire to be robust in our thinking, both theoretically, to think about what other theories, what other explanations might help explain an outcome we're looking at, as well as being robust in our empirical measures. If you look at how something unfolds in one case, think about how it might have unfolded differently at a different period of time within that country, or whether that explanation of one country can apply to other countries at the same time period or at different time periods. So this is a measure by Freedom House that I mentioned earlier, those countries that are free, partly free, or non-free. And then what you can see is geographic clustering of democracies in Western Europe, Latin America, and North America, as well as clustering of non-free countries in the Middle East, Asia, and some parts of Asia and some parts of Africa. And there's been a robust literature. Håvard Hegre, in his article for this week, which I'll link below, and which hopefully my students have read by now, is a great literature review for explaining how you conceive democracy and the effect that has had across the broader literature. So in democracy or autocracy, it could be a 0-1, or free, or not free, partly free, and free. But there's a whole bunch of different ways at trying to link theory and evidence that I want to make sure that you're aware of. The Varieties of Democracy project, which is now, I think, basically a decade old, has been a huge resource, a great resource in moving our understanding forward of the many factors of what goes into a democracy. They focus on the electoral core. So hopefully see if you completed the lecture question in the last section, if you thought about what you conceptualize as a democracy. Often people will put the elections at the core of what makes a democracy, and then other values around that. And in the Varieties of Democracy project, they have 6 democratic properties that they look at. The electoral rulers are responsible to citizens through competition for the approval of a broad electorate during periodic elections. So leaders are constrained by their needs to maintain support of at least a large percentage of citizens within the country. Liberal values that are intrinsic are protecting individual and minority rights against the potential tyranny of the majority. This links into the legal aspects I mentioned earlier, that the first part, through elections, usually it's a majority or a plurality of voters get to decide who the leader is. And the next one, what makes a liberal democracy, is that majority rules or plurality rules is tempered by rights and protections for people who aren't likely to have the power to be able to be elected. There are minority rights protected against the tyranny of the majority in a number of different countries that we've already mentioned in this class. Burundi last week, you have a sizable majority that's 80% of the population Hutu, and roughly 20% minority of Tutsi. Same with, or similar in Rwanda. How those kind of breakdowns within society could potentially allow the majority to make policies that could violate various rights or interests of minority groups within the country. Participatory democracy can include a direct rule and active participation of citizens during the political process and their ability to make sure that their interests are heard and understood by their representatives. Deliberative democracy, that decisions for the public good should be informed by a respectful and reason-based dialogue at all level. That's the ideal, that there should be a deliberative process by which laws are passed. The costs and benefits, like we saw last week, of particular outcomes should be considered before policies are being made. I've been reading a book for my election violence project in which it traces the violence of the U.S. Congress in the 19th century. Often there is a really antiseptic perception of legislatures and executives as being a rather refined area, but this was not always the case in the 19th century. The January 6th insurrection in the U.S. last year might have been a completely different kind of challenge since the British invasion in the War of 1812, but there were smaller scale skirmishes in the U.S., and you can find YouTube videos of the dialogue not always being deliberative in the South Korean legislature and others around the world. Last element is egalitarian principles underlying democratic systems. Inequalities that are material or immaterial inhibit the actual use of formal political rights and liberties. So you want to make sure that everyone should ideally have equal access to the other aspects of the democratic political system. And similar to the Gapminder website that we used in this class last week, the Varieties of Democracy has a visualization website where you can plot different aspects of democratic institutions, political institutions. Here I plotted the egalitarian component against the electoral component, and you do see quite a strong relationship between those. As you become more electorally competitive, you also see more egalitarian issues, that you do see that there is variety across geographic regions. Here you can play with it in a bunch of different ways, see it's how it played over time. But the idea is that in what makes a democracy, we have to think about how the rules are made and how it's supposed to work in a rule-based system, a de jure approach to democracy. But then it's also important to understand the de facto, how the sausage is actually made, what roles leaders and citizens actually play in political institutions. And we're going to focus on, in the next section, is linking those political institutions theoretically and empirically to understanding what might drive certain countries to be more likely to have conflict and not others. So let's get to that.